Next question we need to look at is, where is the power consolidated within a country? If we say that the power, or most or all of it, is with the national government, like we see in Great Britain and Russia and China and Iran, then we say we have a unitary government. Um, if you have power all resting in the regional governments, like we had in America under the Articles of Confederation, or in the South during the Civil War, then you would have a confederal system. If it's shared power, the national government and the regional governments both have defined powers, then you have what we have in the United States, along with Mexico and Nigeria, which is a federal system. Now, one thing that's happening in some unitary systems, like Great Britain, for example, we're seeing the devolution of power from the national government down to the regional governments. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, where we have kind of a weird situation with these different states within one kingdom, you kind of have the drive to have some other power in those places. So, like Northern Ireland and Scotland have, over the last few years, demanded that they have more of a say on their affairs. And so, power has devolved from the British Parliament down to those local assemblies. When you look at executives, there are two things to consider: the head of government and the head of state. The one who runs the government, the one who is driving policymaking, is the head of government. In Britain and Russia, that's the prime minister. In Mexico, that's the president. Um, in China, it's the premier. So it kind of depends on where you are as to who exactly holds this position of head of government. The head of state is the ceremonial head. In some situation, that means that they have no power. In some situation, it means they have a ton of power. So, for example, in Great Britain, the Queen has some power, not a whole lot of power. But if you go to Iran, the supreme leader is the head of state, and he's very, very powerful, but he's more of a behind the scenes power. Um, in a lot of systems like the United States, one person serves both of these capacities. The President of the United States is both the head of government and the head of state. Elections are important because it tells us a lot about the political system that is being reviewed and why we have certain party systems, for example, where you can recall Diverger's law. So, for example, the first past the post system, which is what we use here in the United States, the British do so as well, and Nigerians. Um, First past the post is a horse racing term that means whoever gets past the finish line first wins. You have one winner. And so, for that reason, we also call them single member district pluralities. So, in other words, if you win the plurality in one congressional district, then you are the single member who represents that district. So, you cram all those things into the single member district plurality. So, in other words, the candidate with the most votes in a defined area wins. Mostly, we're talking about congressional seats. And so in Britain, if you're running for parliament of a certain area and you get the most votes, you represent that area. So in that system, first past the post, candidates compete against each other. In proportional systems, there are no districts, and there's really not, essentially not any candidates either. You're more voting for parties. And for this reason, as we see in Russia for Duma elections, which is their legislature, parties can not get a whole lot of votes. They can get 10, 20, 25% of the votes and still get seats. And it's for this reason that some countries have many parties. They're most likely use a proportional system where lesser parties can have smaller vote counts and still get seats in Congress. They can exist even being a minor party. In a first past the post system, minor parties can't compete. You have to be one of the two big parties. And so Diverger's law tells us that first past the post elections give us two party systems. And then therefore, to win, you stay close to the middle, which is Downes's law. So party systems, Downes's law, Diverger's laws, election types are all tied together. We also have some systems where we have a majority runoff, like the Russian presidency, where you have a whole bunch of candidates and you have voting, and the top two from the first round move on to the runoff where the winner is determined, unless usually there's a provision where if you get a majority in the first round, then you automatically win. Iran does it the same way. And yes, of course, to make it complicated, there are some countries that do all of these things or a combination of these things. Mexico, for example, has congressional elections that have both seats determined by single-member district plurality and some seats that are determined by proportion. Like we mentioned before, party systems have a direct tie to what kind of elections you have. So one thing that we need to consider with party systems are they competitive or not? In democratic systems, we see pretty much the free and open competition amongst various parties. Whereas in authoritarian systems or non-competitive systems, usually one party is going to dominate. Like in China, for example, you have one-party rule by the Chinese Communist Party. In Russia, you ultimately have one party. Putin's party, United Russia, calls the shots. But another thing that factors into this is what kind of elections you have. So Diverger's law says that single-member district plurality elections, first past the post elections, create two-party systems because to get a seat in those systems, you got to be the winner. And so therefore, you're going to stay close to the middle, and only really two parties can compete. In proportional elections, you can be a minor party and get a smaller vote share and still wind up with seats. Theoretically, you could get 15% of the votes in an election, and you'd get 15% of the seats, more or less. So you take that, and then the next step is when you wind up with two-party systems because of the kind of elections that you have, this tells us where the parties are going to be on the ideological spectrum. So Downes's law says that if you have a two-party system, which is going to be in existence because of single-member district plurality elections, then your parties are going to stay close to the middle. Democrats and Republicans, despite what our census tell us, stay pretty close to the middle. They could be far more extreme, but they want to win, so they play it safe, stay close to the middle where most of the voters are. In multi-party systems, where you don't have to win, if you're in a proportional election system, you can have multiple parties, and they know that they can kind of scatter away from the middle, and there are a degree of people that will still vote for them, in which case they could still wind up with seats. So Downes's law, two-party systems, two parties will stay close to the middle in order to win elections. Multi-party systems can scatter because they can still get seats and hold on to more extreme positions. In parliamentary systems, minority parties may create coalitions to gain power when there's no majority. So like in 2010, in Britain, the winning party with the most seats in the legislature or in the parliament were the Conservatives, but they didn't have enough to have voting power, meaning they could overrule everybody else. And so sometimes minor parties will join a coalition with another party, usually a big party, and make agreements with one another to support, say, the prime minister if you're the minority party, and then the majority party will turn around and say, we'll put some of your issues on the agenda. So you see this a lot of times in parliamentary systems. Interest groups vary around the world as well. Here in the West, we know them as pluralist systems, where groups represent the interest of the people and try to influence the policymakers for certain kinds of policy. But it's not that way all over the world. Many places in the world, including some places in the West, have corporatist groups. In a corporatist system, you have interest groups that are acting on behalf not of the people, but of the government. And so really they're indoctrination tools. So the government will create groups that look like they're from the people, but they'll tell them go out and sell these policies to the public, make the public get on board of our agenda. And you see that in just about all the countries that we're going to take a look. Britain and the United States being really the two best defined pluralist systems. We also have different types of groups. The kind of group that we probably first think of is the associational group. Groups that hire lobbyists, that collect union dues or workers' dues or whatever, and try to go to Washington to influence the policymakers here in the United States. But there's also other kinds of groups that we can define as interest groups. Non-associational groups, for example, might be a workers' protest as opposed to a workers' union. So a workers' protest might just sporadically rise up, and you don't necessarily have name list or nobody's paying any dues or anything like that, and it just may happen sporadically. You also have institutional governments that have interests. And so groups inside of government, inside the government institutions, bureaucratic cabinet departments, agencies like the Labor Department, um, they may very well act in their interest as well, especially in a corporatist system. Um, and then we can further break down these associational groups as NGOs and quangos. So in pluralist systems, we may call these groups NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. Here in the United States, we mostly call them special interest or interest groups. Globally, the term that is more commonly used is NGOs. In corporatist systems, and sometimes in pluralist systems, you have quasi-non-governmental organizations, which are quangos, which, sometimes you have groups that are somewhat government, meaning they have government in their DNA, but they act independently. Here in the United States, government-sponsored enterprises like Sallie Mae or Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, these kinds of things are government-created banks who act in their own interest. So they're kind of straddling the line between government and non-government, so they would be considered quangos. Interest groups, in the West and in pluralist systems, we think of this is how the people voice their needs and their opinions. But there are other ways that this can happen with groups, especially if you consider the different types of groups we just mentioned. So obviously the legitimate channels would be lobbying, going public, running commercials, electioneering, protests, that sort of thing, going to court. But also civil disobedience. You could break the law as a group to make your voice heard. And then in a lot of these countries where we have a corporatist system, where the groups are working for the government to try to influence the people, how do the people then make their voices heard? Well, a lot of times it happens through these patron-client networks. And patronage, you may remember from U.S. history, is a term where basically government officials are awarding certain kinds of people with jobs or favors in exchange for votes or for donations or whatever. In the United States, this is illegal today. But if you're a citizen and you want to get your voice heard, say it could be getting policy through, getting yourself a better home for your family, a better job, or simply getting through a road that's been barricaded by police, you may have to engage in a patron-client network, which is you got to do something as a favor. This could be as dirty as a bribe, or this could be a promise to do something in your neighborhood, to some quite sinister things, actually. But this is kind of the underground, the black market kind of stuff that happens when the lights go down. People are going to get their needs met through these patron-client networks, different channels of access other than the ones that we see on TV and hear about all the time. Political culture is really something that asks the question, how do people feel about politics? What's the political climate in a certain country? So we write to some familiar terms here: sources of political socialization. How do people get their political opinions? Family, school, media, religion, from the state, through textbooks or media. Well, we need to point out at this point, in the United States, it's all of these things. And it's usually all these things in every country, but as you go from country to country, some of these things are going to become more important than others. So, for example, in Nigeria, the family in your community is going to be the main driver. Your ethnic group is going to be the main determining factor of how you get socialized. In religious focused countries like Iran, religion is going to play a big role. In more authoritarian regimes, you're going to get the media and the state and the schools indoctrinating people to think a certain way, like in Russia, for example. So as we go from country to country, we're going to see different things being focused upon when it comes to how people get their opinions on politics. There are lots of ways that people can participate in a political culture. Voting, petitioning, running for office, all the way down to some of the things we mentioned just a few moments ago. Grassroots demonstration, civil disobedience, protesting, rioting, and these kinds of things. But it kind of speaks as to how healthy the political culture is, based on what you see from the types of citizen participation. If you got more conventional methods of participation, then you know you have a stable system with legitimacy that reflects a strong political culture. If you see a lot of civil disobedience, well, then you might not have as strong a political culture. Not to say that politics doesn't happen and that people don't have passions and goals to be met, but it doesn't necessarily suggest that the political culture is strong. You know, you have a good, strong political culture when you have stability and legitimacy and you have a strong civil society. So, civil society is everything non government. So, in a society where people engage in politics, they do things on their own, they have a sense of individualism where they're not being forced to do anything corporately by the government, then you have a strong civil society. So, this also means that if you have a strong civil society, then you have a lot of things happening, a lot of functions in society happening outside of government. So, this can be clubs, professional sports, media, entertainment, cultural activities, art. All these things can happen outside the government. And a lot of people would suggest in a strong civil society, um, government could close its doors. You give a government shutdown, and society would still function relatively well. But to a point, obviously, things would start to break down into anarchy. The media, as we know, plays an important agenda-setting function. If it's a place, usually in a liberal democracy, where you have a free and independent media, free from government control as far as content, then you're going to have a strong civil society because the media is going to voice the agenda of the citizens as a linkage institution, as opposed to being a tool of indoctrination for the government. When we ask the question, what are the sources of cleavages in a certain country? These are the sources of conflict. So, in a civil society or in a political culture altogether, um, what kind of things divide the people? And so, again, in certain countries, in certain places, you're going to have different elements of division amongst the people or conflict. So, in Nigeria, we'll learn that it's ethnicity that divides people. Um, in China, it would be race and class, and this could be gender, religion, or region. Like in Britain and Mexico, you got a lot of regional tensions. In Iran, it's about age. So it can be lots of different things that divide the civil society, and those things sometimes become the biggest issues for the government to deal with as well. When we talk about political and economic change, these would be ways that changes happen. And we can define some of these as key terms, like reform, for example. Reform is usually the slowest and most political way to deal with things in terms of the state making things. So reforms can happen through elections and through new people getting into power and pushing a new agenda. Revolution can take much less time. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it can happen within months, like what happens in China and Iran in 1979. You get a regime overthrown by a new set of power holders, and then you get a new agenda to go along with it. A coup d'état, like we saw in Russia and Nigeria on multiple occasions. Coup d'état is overthrowing the government violently, just in the hands of a few people. And so change can happen politically through different means. When we talk about economic systems, we see some common ways that change can happen. Privatization, for example, when you go from a command economy to a more free market economy, you take those things that were controlled by the government, like energy or utilities, and hand that over to private businesses that are going to function better. It may not be quite as fair, but it's going to produce a heck of a lot more. Foreign investment, integration toward the global community. A lot of the countries that we're going to see are moving in one direction or another in terms of their economic systems. Um, Another global trend that's happening is one toward democratization. We've had various waves of democratization since the beginning of World War I. The first wave was when we saw the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and we saw a lot of new democratic systems be born. And then again after World War II, as the British Empire broke up, we see a lot of new independent countries in Nigeria and Asia and the Middle East. And then after the Cold War, we saw a lot of those Central Asian former Soviet republics get independence and begin that long journey toward a liberal democratic system. So we are indeed kind of waiting for the next big trend. Will it be toward democracy? Will it be toward socialism? Will it be something brand new that we didn't see coming? Who knows? But it's been quite an amazing run these last 150 years or so. Amazing things have been happening on this planet in terms of politics and economic systems changing very rapidly and just in massive amounts. Developing countries becomes a subtopic of economic change. And one of the things we're doing in the modern world as we become more global is how do we help these countries become, get caught up with the modern world, move from an agrarian society from a developing country up to an industrial country. And there's a couple of theories on this. One is the educational link. The more education you have in a country, the more democratic you become. And then the more democratic you are and you experience freedom, well, then you want to have that economically as well. And so therefore you become more capitalist. So more education leads to more democracy leads to more capitalism. This has kind of been the trend in the last century or so. And so therefore, that's why I hear so much about certain countries putting an educational system together, because that's really the key that will unlock progress. But again, there are many people who are rejecting this and saying democracy is not enough anymore. It needs to be more socialistic, and economies need to be planned. So we need mixed economies with the socialist agenda where we have total equality. We've learned from the communism era that you can't quite go that far, but we've also rejected freedom and total citizen freedom, and in terms of making their own economic decisions. We've kind of trying to find this middle ground now with socialism and mixed economies. Structural adjustment programs, SAPs, are the prerequisites that many developing countries must implement before they're going to get help from one of the big banks, the IMF or the World Bank. So in other words, they're going to say, all right, we're going to give you a big chunk of money, billions of dollars, and you need to show us that you can balance your books, balance your trade, lower your trade barriers, get a stable currency, which a lot of times it's these countries that need this help are have no ability to even implement these elementary things. Most of the advanced industrial countries don't do these things. And so, but at the same time, these big banks aren't going to give away money. And so you see this ultimately leads to the next thing, the dependency theory. It holds that a small number of established nations continually are fed by developing nations at the expense of those developing nations' own health. In other words, this is kind of the post-colonial theory that says that the major industrial nations, mainly of the West, are holding their foot on the throat of developing countries, taking their resources, using their labor for their own interests, which I'm sure part of the time is part of the deal, but it becomes an excuse a lot of times, or a blame game for political purposes, to say that a certain country is not getting on its feet because the big boys are picking on them. So dependency theory, there are some definite elements of that are very common. Again, devolution is happening as countries that have a strong national government are giving more power to local governments. But the other thing is happening in the other direction. Again, we're kind of in the final days of the nation state, where you have one kind of people inside of one country, and therefore, since everybody agrees or since everybody is the same, I should say, they most likely are going to agree on things. But that's just not the way it is anymore. In various countries, there are multinational, multi-ethnic countries, and therefore it's making more sense to devolve the power down to regional bodies, like Great Britain has done, because each of those local or regional areas have the interests of the people who live there in mind. There is no one national agenda anymore. But the other thing that's happening is that power is moving toward globalization as well. And so, therefore, since there is no more nation state, or as it's dying as we speak, it makes more sense to move toward a supranational or global perspective on things. That would include total tolerance, everybody moving on to to equality country by country, helping developing countries move up to industrial countries, and trying to hold back industrial countries from stealing everything supposedly. And so the UN, the European Union, are representative of countries working together for common interests. Even though they're all going to be different, they all have common interests, things that every single kind of person is going to agree with. The last thing is public policy, and this is mostly stuff that you'd be familiar with. We might see some different terms, though, when we're talking about global politics. So what about spending? What do countries spend their money on? And we can go off and list all the things that money can be spent on, but we can also consider the strategy. In other words, your fiscal public policy of spending, what kind of achievement are you trying to make? What is your end game? And so there's 4 classifications. You could be a country that is a night watchman state, which is you spend your money, only enough money, and only enough government intervention to keep order. So you're going to spend a lot of money on police, pretty much provide the bare minimum of things needed to keep society functioning. A la a night watchman, which is a security guard who is not really going to stop anything, but at least it gives them a little bit of hesitancy to the bad guys who are going to maybe rob the store. The police state would be a little bit more elevated. So instead of having the security guard at night, now you got a full-on police force guarding the store. So now you got excessive regulation and excessive intrusion, like we see with China and Iran. The police state is trying to keep people down, a very Hobbesian concept. So all the money that gets spent is keeping people in their place and doing the will of the state more than it is of the people. The regulatory state is a little more laxed on the security, but it's still going to have a lot of government control, but for the purpose of regulation of business or of the public sector or whatever to create some kind of fair and just society. So Russia would be this way. In fact, many people would consider Russia to be more of a police state than a regulatory state. But most countries in Russia or in Europe, would be considered regulatory states, if not a full-fledged welfare state. So a welfare state would be an unabashed desire to see all the money spent on social programs, meaning really all the money that is collected by the government in taxation is going to be spent on cutting checks to people for Social Security, for unemployment assistance, for welfare, whatever it may be. And so that's the division between the regulatory state and the welfare state is subtle. Just think to yourself, in a regulatory state, most of the money is being spent on government things in order to regulate and create a fair society. Meaning it's a lot of administrative stuff, paying government employees and whatnot. In a welfare state, you have that as well, but if you look at the United States budget, the vast majority of the money is being dished out in terms of social programs, entitlements and benefits and things like that. When we talk about how governments get their revenues, we use the term extraction. And there are really 2 types of taxes. There are direct taxes on people, which are usually progressive, where the wealthy are paying higher rates than everybody else. And then there's indirect taxes, taxes on things, which are usually regressive, probably because there's a cap on a lot of these indirect taxes, which mean that it's more painful for lower income people to pay these than it is for somebody who's wealthy, like a sales tax, for example. But with direct taxes, you have personal and corporate income taxes. You've got capital gains taxes, which is taxes on investment income. And again, usually when we talk about direct taxes on people, on their incomes, it's usually for the purpose of redistributing the wealth. That's why they're progressive taxes. You take from the rich, give to the poor and the middle class. Indirect taxes are usually for revenues, a lot of times for state and local governments as well, like the sales tax, which is that simply the act of buying something is being taxed. Value-added taxes are something they use in Europe, which are a big favorite of the politicians because the tax has been embedded in each stage of production of that particular item. And then when you sell it in the store as retail, then there's no tax on it, and then the consumer is going to say, "Oh wow, tax free," and the salesman can sell it as tax free, and everybody leaves home happy. But the people are still paying the taxes; it's just been embedded into the price. We have excise taxes, which are taxes on things, commodities, a lot of times on bad things that we don't want people to use, like alcohol or cigarettes. Property taxes are a big source of revenues for here in the United States for local governments, but we have them in other places as well. Tariffs, we kind of passed the age of tariffs, which are taxes on imports. They used to be protective in nature to try to protect your own industries against competition from foreign entities. But nowadays, they might be used only for economic sanctions or something like that. And then you got payroll taxes, which maybe should be in the direct taxes section, but these are taxes taken from paychecks to pay for social programs. So your FDIC here in the United States comes out of your check and goes directly into the coffers for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and welfare and whatnot. Rentier states, who are always kind of the exception to these things, don't necessarily rely on taxes as much as mixed or capitalist economies do. Instead, they're going to get their revenues from the national industry, which is probably oil. So, in other words, the government's going to nationalize the oil industry and then sell it off to other countries and take that revenue to basically fund all of your government enterprises. Outputs is where we look at the policy performance. Is a certain policy working or not? And a lot of these things are based on data. So whenever you're looking at numbers and statistics, you're basically in the output stage of public policy. So for example, what about the economy? How healthy is the economy of a certain country? Well, we look at GDP. But there are different classifications of GDP. You have aggregate GDP, which is in 1 year's time, how much did a certain country produce? And that gives you a snapshot of that particular year. How good did we do this year? Or you can look at the per capita GDP, which is taking the GDP and dividing it by the amount of people that you have. So the per capita GDP, or the purchasing power parity index, is going to tell us how much of a share of the wealth does everybody get. And then again, you can look at the real GDP, where you adjust historical GDP numbers for inflation so that you can compare year-to-year growth or a long-term trend of growth for a certain country. So, and if you adjust it for inflation, then you've got real numbers to compare, and therefore you can kind of get a good indication as to whether the country's economy is growing or diminishing over time. You can also look at other monetary things like the unemployment rate, the poverty line, the inflation rate. All these things are intertwined together based on the health of the economy. You can look at fiscal numbers like budget deficits and surpluses and the national debt, your balance of trade. You can also look at income equality, which is something that a lot of people are looking at these days. How much of a distribution of wealth do you have? If you look at a snapshot of it, the Gini index, then the Lorenz curve would be a snapshot of a certain country's wealth distribution at any given moment. Whereas the Kuznets curve would tell us what kind of income equality can you expect at certain stages of development. So if you are a developing state, you're most likely going to have a pretty poor distribution of wealth. But as you move toward industrialization, things will balance out. And then the theory is also that if you move into advanced stages of development where you are become more and more capitalist, then you're again going to have a poor distribution of wealth. A lot of these things are theoretical. We don't have a whole lot of instances that we could use to demonstrate this. But income equality, obviously a big thing in the modern era. This is why we have so many progressive taxes and so much wealth distribution, because we want to see more balance. And then the last thing is the HDI, which is the Human Development Index, which is going to measure the health of a country, both physical, intellectually, mentally, and so on. And so we can look at things like life expectancy, infant mortality, literacy rates, education rates, standards of living. You could also weave in some of these other things that I mentioned, per capita income, poverty line, stuff like that can all be factored in. So Human Development Index, basically what is your quality of life in a particular country.